Kia ora koutou and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name's Kathy Errington. I'm the Executive Director of the Helen Clark Foundation. And if you haven't heard of us before, we're a public policy think tank based at AUT in Auckland. We're really proud to be here today with the New Zealand Drug Foundation. We're co-hosting today's webinar in the hope that for those of you who may not made up your minds yet about which way you're going to vote in this year's referendum, we hope we can help make the case for reform. In many ways, this is an unusual event for our organisation. We're a public policy think tank. We don't campaign on any other issue, but we feel that when the research is as clear as the research is about cannabis and New Zealand's current cannabis laws, we think it would be disingenuous to pretend that we don't have an opinion about what we'd like to see happen in September. So for that reason, we're co-hosting today's webinar, and I hope that you can check out the research report that we did on this last year. I'll just share a link to that in the chat once I finish talking. We published last year on the current state of New Zealand's cannabis laws and why we believe that they needed to change. So if you would like to read more about the issues you see raised today, please do take the chance to check it out. We think that the opportunity facing New Zealand at the moment to change our drug laws is a once-in-a-generation chance, and if we don't take it, the opportunity may not come up again for many, many years. So without further ado, I'd like to just thank our panelists for joining us. We've got here today the Right Honourable Helen Clark, Dr. Hinimur Elder and Steve Rolls. It's fantastic to be here with such a distinguished panel of speakers. And I'll now hand over to the Executive Director of the New Zealand Drug Foundation, Ross Bell, who will be asking the questions today. Thank you very much.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks, Kathy, for opening. Actually, one thing, Kathy, she mentioned the Helen Clark Foundation report that they released, the case for yes, but one thing she didn't mention is a poll that the foundation opinion poll that they just released first thing this morning, which should let us all know how close this referendum is. The poll that was done by UMR, which is a very reputable polling company, has the yes vote sitting on 48% and the no vote sitting on 43%. So that gives you a sort of a sense of no side yet has a majority, so this is really important. Look, welcome to the fifth in the series of webinars that the Drug Foundation's been hosting, during lockdown to inform and educate people about the cannabis referendum. I think Carly Mercier, our policy manager, who's been coordinating all of these webinars, has described this one as the fifth and final webinar, but I actually think we need to hold a few more, so we might get some of these, keep these things happening in the last 10 weeks of the campaign. Hey, look, also like the Helen Clark Foundation, the Drug Foundation would not normally find itself in such a position where it's having to campaign essentially on something so political, but we feel that it's really important that this is a once-in-a-generation chance that we've got to shift the whole way that New Zealand sees its drug problem, to move it away from a punitive approach to a public health approach. And we firmly believe that the evidence is on our side. And we're really lucky to have some great panelists today to talk us through some of that evidence. This webinar is about the case for yes, and we'll hear a little bit about that soon. But before I introduce our amazing panelists, I just want to run through some of the webinar housekeeping for you. We can't see you and we can't hear you on this webinar, but we would love to hear from you using either the chat function or the Q&A. So if you have any questions, do put them in the Q&A and I'll keep a track of that. We've got time at the end of the webinar after the panelists have shared to run through some of your questions. So feel free to put them in the Q&A and in the chat, say hi, where are you from, where are you calling from, what your interest in is in this. We've got over 420 people on this webinar, so it's great to have such a big audience. questions. And yes, so we're streaming this on Facebook as well. So if you're on Facebook, put your questions in the comments, and we've got a couple of moderators both on Zoom and on Facebook who will make sure the questions get to me. It's my great pleasure now to introduce our panelists. I'm going to introduce them and then I'm going to ask them in less than a minute to explain their top reason for voting yes. So the first person I'm going to ask that of is the Right Honourable Helen Clark, who doesn't need introduction, but we're going to do it anyway because you're so fabulous. Helen was Prime Minister of New Zealand from 1999 to 2008, and then moved to New York to head as Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, and where she was also Chair of the UN Development Group from 2009 to 2017. Helen continues to be highly engaged in issues across the sustainable development spectrum, from gender equality and women's leadership to climate action, health and drug policy, open government and peace. Helen is a member of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which has a lot of former world leaders, country leaders who have come together to help shift some of the global debates around drug policy. And most recently, she has lent her support to starting the new public policy think tank, the Helen Clark Foundation, which she serves as patron. The Helen Clark Foundation launched in March 2019 and is based at Aotearoa University, and Kathy is their executive director. So Helen, in less than a minute, tell us your top reason for voting yes.
In 1 minute, I think it is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to address long-standing injustice and harm caused by prohibition. Injustice to all of those who have been imprisoned and otherwise convicted of offences connected with cannabis, whether that be for use and possession or for supply. That has impacted absolutely disproportionately on Māori in New Zealand, with an arrest and conviction rate of 3 times that of non-Māori. This is wrong, and it is wrong that mainly young people find their lives blighted by a conviction in this area for a choice of drug which is less harmful than either tobacco or alcohol. So that's my 1 minute reason.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helen. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Hinimur Elder, who again shouldn't need any introduction because she's so awesome, but I will anyway. Hinimur is of Ngāti Kuri, Te Ao Pōuri, Te Rarawa and Ngāpuhi descent. She's a fellow of the Royal Australia and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists and has been a consultant to child and adolescent psychiatrist for more than 10 years. She was a recipient of the Eru Pomare postdoc fellow of the Health Research Council from 2014 to 2018. And I mention that because Eru Pomare was one of the founders of the New Zealand Drug Foundation. So when I saw that on your CV, I thought I did have to mention that. Hinimur is the Māori strategic leader for Brain Research New Zealand, and she was a member of the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor expert panel on cannabis, which released its report yesterday. Same question to you, Hinimur. Tell us why you would vote yes.
Nā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa e ngā haue whā, e ngā rauranga tirama a tēnā koutou. Well, it's 2020. Aotearoa New Zealand deserves a health-focused, evidence-based, ethical approach to cannabis. We are part of a thoughtful, caring global community, and we've seen some countries already reconsidering their cannabis laws and regulations according to their histories, their assessment of cannabis-related harm, and what works in terms of harm reduction. We in Aotearoa need cannabis policy and legislation that accepts and sensibly governs cannabis use as part of our daily reality. We know that our current prohibitive position, our status quo, doesn't work. It has failed us. It fails to prevent cannabis use. It fails to control potency and cost. it fails to protect our most vulnerable. Our current approach is wasteful in terms of money and lives. It wastes police time, court time, jail time, and it wastes people. All of this costs money and it forces people to act criminally in their access to cannabis, and to what benefit? To my mind, it's a dehumanizing context that we are in right now. It treats people as criminal objects with disregard for the health impacts, and it perpetuates inequalities for Māori. It assumes that a simple punitive response to the health-related issues is the end of the story. It isn't. It doesn't work. The current approach is not fit for purpose, and it must change. No policy will make cannabis and its use disappear. However, we can expect society to be better off if we legalise cannabis, regulate use and supply, and directly address and reduce key risks and harms, educate in meaningful ways, rather than continuing the ineffective and costly efforts of prohibition.
Kia ora. Thank you, Hinimur. I'm going to vote yes based on both of your interventions there, but let's hear from our third panelist, Steve Rolls, who is writer and senior policy analyst at Transform Drug Policy Foundation, which is a global NGO based in London that has, for a very long time, been one of the only voices for legal regulation of drugs, ahead of many people. Steve's been at Transform since 1998. He's, according to your bio, he is a prolific writer. He's led most of Transform's seminal publications, including the 2009 After the War on Drugs Blueprint for Regulation, and the more recent guide on how to regulate cannabis, a practical guide. And just last month, Steve and colleagues put out two fabulous reports, which I recommend, which analysed legalisation out of the United States and the more recent legalisation out of Canada. Transform are really committed to the evidence, and I think you'll find the documents that they put out really nicely balanced, although they're obviously a pro-reform organisation. You'll always find Steve on global and UK media talking about these issues. He's a brilliant academic. Like all brilliant academics, he has a bachelor's degree in geography, which I recommend everyone gets, and a master's degree in development studies. So a man after my own heart. So Steve, assuming you were in New Zealand and having to acknowledge that it's midnight where you are in London, if you were in New Zealand, how would you vote and why?
Well, I've got 10 weeks to get citizenship and vote, but I would vote yes. I think it's self-evident to anybody, even a cursory review. It's very clear that the status quo has failed. It's not delivering the outcomes we all want, as Helen and Hinimur have already touched upon. And I would urge people. It's not about whether you like cannabis or approve of cannabis, or you don't like cannabis or you don't approve of cannabis. This is about dealing with reality, and the reality is, firstly, that cannabis is here, and lots of people are using it whether you like it or not, and regardless of prohibition. And secondly, that the status quo simply isn't addressing the issues associated with cannabis. It's actually making them worse. And we have a choice. We can either continue with the status quo, or we can try something different. And we have that once in a generation choice now, to choose instead of leaving it in the hands of an unregulated criminal market and all the problems that causes, to bring it within the ambit of government and put the market in control of responsible government agencies acting in the interests of the public good. There isn't a third option in which this market will just somehow magically disappear. So it's either criminal market or it's a regulated market. Now, obviously, the regulated market, the devil is in the detail. What does the regulation mean? What's it going to be like? I've looked at this bill. I've worked on drug policy development in Canada and Uruguay and Mexico and other places around the world, Luxembourg. This bill, it's not perfect, but it's good. It's been put together by experts with solid principles. I think it addresses most of the major points. And even if it's not to everybody's liking in all the details, it is vastly better than the status quo. And mistakes will be made, but they can be ironed out in time. These things aren't written in stone. Anything would be better than prohibition, but this bill is enormously better than prohibition. So I would encourage everybody on that basis to vote yes.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. What I'm going to do now is, before we move into the Q&A, I'm just going to run through a few questions to each of our panelists. Some of the hot topics we know that people are asking about. So we're going to try to cover off the health impacts, the criminal justice impacts, and key features of the bill that we're voting on. So, Hinimur, I've got a series of questions to you first. Critics of legalisation claim that legalising will increase cannabis harm because it will increase use, particularly among young people and Māori. Now, you've dedicated your professional life to improving health outcomes for young Māori. So can you explain why this means that you strongly support a yes vote? You know, shouldn't we be worried about the potential increase in harm?
Kia ora. Absolutely, we should be worried and we should be concerned and we should examine our own responses to those concerns very carefully. I'm a mum and I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. So every day I'm confronted with these sorts of questions from whānau members, from teachers, from colleagues. So I want to focus on what seems to be at the heart of this question, which is about frequency of use as a contributor to harms. As I said, my practice-based evidence and the global literature are very much aligned. What we know is that younger, more frequent users of higher potency cannabis products are at greater risk of harms. And as you've already heard, our current situation has no mechanisms for controlling those aspects. So one of the things we can do, and I've already seen on the chat that people are asking about other jurisdictions around the world, we can look at those other jurisdictions for some indication of use post-legalisation. Let's be mindful again, because we're careful considering, we're careful in our consideration of these concerns around looking to other parts of the world, because they've got different histories, they've got different baseline cannabis use, different Indigenous experiences, different patterns of cannabis use in concert with other substances, including alcohol and methamphetamine. And I hope we do get a chance to touch on those contextual issues later on. So just keeping in mind that the intellectual findings can give us a rough idea only, but there are some very useful findings from recent reports that have come out of Canada in February. So what we can take from their experience and what they've reported is that the young people aged 15 to 17, the use has declined. In fact, the group who'd used in the last 3 months, their use had nearly halved from almost 20% to just over 10%. And so it's interesting to consider, well, why might that be? We're not entirely clear. It seems like one of the issues is it's harder for young people to get hold of cannabis in a legalised and regulated market, and we like that. We want it to be very, very hard, and the New Zealand framework says it's only legal for people 20 and up. So we still have a very clear view about the harms for our young people, and we want to maintain a much tighter set of constraints around that, and our regulation context proposes that. So the Canada example suggests that it's harder to get hold of it for young people. It's less cool, perhaps, is one of the other suggestions when it's legal. And the other key influencer seems to be that there's been effective implementation of cannabis-related taxes in funding effective education, evidence-based harm reduction campaigns. So whenever we scientists, doctors, policymakers see this kind of evidence, then we consider, well, what about other parts of the world? Is this a one-off? Is this unique to Canada? And so interestingly, and I think importantly for our discussion today, there's evidence from the states in Canada who have legalized, and so that shows that this is not a unique finding, and it's not merely a statistical finding. It's a real finding that is happening in people's lives. So there's some other stats that I could talk about there, but we could come back to that. I wanted to mention in this context about drug driving, which is something that many people, many of my patients and their parents and their wider whānau ask me about. And so importantly, the Canadian report that just came out also talked about the fact that driving within 2 hours of using cannabis, that's around 13% in the Canadian context, that hasn't changed. So perhaps I'll leave my comments in response to that question there for now, but there are several other points that I'm sure people want to pick up on and we can hopefully discuss later.
Fantastic, thanks Hinimur. I think what the conundrum we have is the assumption that legalisation represents some kind of free-for-all, and that things are, just naturally must get worse. And when the evidence, actually says, well, no, it doesn't. Trying to communicate that, I think, is challenging. People have this kind of gut reaction to this thing, and science doesn't always inform that. Steve, I've got a question for you, and actually, it's a question that a lot of that are coming through on the chats as well. So you have helped inform legalisation efforts in Uruguay and in Canada, and your recent reports into the US show that you dug right into the detail of the states that have legalised there, and you've had a wee read of the New Zealand bill. So, in your assessment, comparing maybe the New Zealand bill with other models that you've seen, what marks do you give out of 10? What are some of the strengths? What are the things you like about the New Zealand bill, and are there any kind of fish hooks that that trouble you?
Yeah, I mean, on the whole, I found it very reassuring, and I think at the heart of that reassurance is that the process behind it was the right one. I mean, they clearly got a group of experts from various fields, and they talked to different stakeholders. They examined the evidence from the different legalization processes around the world, and I feel like they've kind of picked out the best bits from things that have happened around the world, and squonked it all together in this bill. Obviously, the devil's in the detail, and we don't have all the detail here because some of it's still to be worked out in the regulations and statutory instruments and so on. But my general impression is that it's very well pitched, it's very well balanced. I mean, I'm very mindful that there are a lot of different stakeholders in this debate. Even on the yes side, different people would want legalization to look different. Your police might have different priorities to your public health people. Your industry people will have, and commercial people will have different priorities. Your kind of activists and sort of and consumers and some of the sort of more libertarian leaning people may have different priorities again. And you're never going to please everybody. There's always going to be compromises. There's, no one's going to go through and think every single thing is absolutely perfect. But on the whole, I think it's well balanced. It seems to be nearer to Canada than to the more commercialized models in the US, and I think that's good. I do have concerns about over commercialization, but things like the advertising ban, not allowing branded products. There are things I might have done that they haven't done. I would probably have gone for state monopoly retailing like they did in some Canadian provinces. But I think, on the whole, the mitigation against the risks of over commercialization are very strong. In terms of the products, I think it was very sensible to have a kind of phased rollout to look at, just herbal cannabis first, and then things like edibles and concentrates later. I had a few concerns. I think not having an online sales outlet is probably a mistake. I think that's a bit harsh on people who don't have easy geographical access, or they're disabled, or for some other reason they can't access the retail stores. I think that's harsh. But I think, details like that, I would guess, will be ironed out in the coming months and years after the victory, obviously, in September. I have a concern about the 20 age limit. Not that I think 20 is necessarily too young, but the fact that it's different from alcohol. The fact alcohol is 18 and cannabis is 20, I have a concern that might preference alcohol for that period of 2 years. And I think a lot of 18 to 20-year-olds will be using cannabis anyway, and you'd be maybe pushing them towards, fines or some form of low-level criminalization, or pushing them to interact with an illegal market or sort of secondary supply. I think that maybe was a bit of a miss. So there are a couple of bits where I think political pressures may have fed in. I think some of the penalties for supply to youth were maybe disproportionate relative to alcohol and tobacco as well. But on the whole, the restriction, the licensing scheme, the products that that are being allowed, the generally cautious approach, I think, is right. And I would bear in mind that these things aren't written in stone. I see, and I'm very pleased to see that there's a robust evaluation process built in. They've set out what their goals are very clearly, and they're going to evaluate and look at the data on whether those goals are being delivered. And if they're not, there is also a review process so that the policy can be adapted and improved and evolve. And if things are going wrong, they can take a step back. If it's maybe too restrictive, they can loosen some things up. So yes, I mean, I think compared to the other models I've seen, I think maybe Uruguay was perhaps too far on the side of restriction. I mean, they actually have you have to register and get a card, and you can only buy government-approved cannabis from pharmacies. Maybe that was over-restrictive. I mean, it was they were the first country to do it. They're trapped between Brazil and Argentina. There were political and reasons for that. But I think the commercial models in the US maybe have gone too far the other way and are over-commercialized. I think New Zealand and Canada have more balanced, appropriate levels of regulation, at least at a starting point. That reflects the process, which is informed by experts, stakeholder dialogue, and a public health mindset. So, and even some of the more restrictive elements. I was very pleased to see home grow is going to be allowed. There is some capacity for cannabis social clubs. So even some of the more restrictive elements of the retail model, there is a kind of pressure valve where certain, niche markets can kind of find their space. So on the whole, I would give it, I think, a 9 out of 10, big thumbs up. And yes, it's generally speaking very good. And I think New Zealand people behind it should be very proud of themselves.
We are. That's our problem. We're very proud of ourselves. We seem to be getting quite a few things right in the world. COVID as well. Everyone, for questions, if you can flick your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat, that will be really helpful, because we're going to come to questions really soon. But a question for you, Helen. We argue on our campaign that one of the benefits of legal regulation is that will free up police time to be able to focus on more serious crime. But our opponents say, well, that's not actually going to happen because police aren't currently arresting and convicting people anyway, and so the status quo is fine. What do you think? Where do you fall on that? This will benefit law enforcement too. This isn't actually a problem anyway.
Well, actually, the status quo isn't fine at all. The last year we have figures for was 2018, and there were well over 2,000 people charged with low-level cannabis offences, and of course over 2,000 convicted on them, and hundreds went to jail. That's not satisfactory. Now, what we know is that the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Act, which was passed last year by Parliament, moved things forward in the sense that it gave a directive to the police not to arrest and prosecute for use and possession. Now, remember, possession is kept at a very, very low level, so you can easily get picked up for supply when you just have what you would use yourself. But it gave the police a discretion. And what we know is that with the systemic bias well documented in our justice system, which discriminates against Māori, we will end up with that discretion continuing to be used in a way that is harmful to Māori. So the status quo is not acceptable. The second thing is that even with what you might call the partial decriminalisation under the Misuse of Drugs Act, it doesn't deal with the issue of supply. So you will still have the people who are using it, who may be diverted if the police feel kindly about it, that they will still be buying in an illegal market. And the people who are growing, whether it's in Northland or the East Coast or the Bay of Plenty, will still be supplying an illegal market. And if they get picked up, they go to jail for supply. So this is not satisfactory. You need to get a grip on this market. Now, I agree with what Steve said. Look, this legislation is actually very cautious, but we shouldn't let perfection be the enemy of the good. This would move things forward immeasurably. It would say, we recognize that this is a drug very widely used. Most Kiwis will use it at some point in their lifetimes, have used it at some point in their lifetimes. They know their teeth don't fall out and their hair doesn't go green. For goodness sake, most people actually don't use it for very long or very often. Unlike alcohol, which can, obviously is used socially by many people on many occasions right through their lives. And the WHO now tells us that no level of alcohol is safe for us. So let's get real here. This is a widely used recreational drug, which is less harmful to individual health than tobacco and alcohol. We need to legalize its use and possession and its supply. We need to regulate that market as the bill does. We will, if this bill can get passed in the referendum, which I very much hope it will, you can only buy legally from licensed sellers. You have a Cannabis Control Authority. You can't sell to under 20s, and there are penalties for that. You know what's in the product that you're buying. This is very important, that you actually have quality control. And I think also importantly, it will open up economic opportunities in the regions which are very conducive to growing cannabis, where people can come into a legal supply market and grow for the licensed recreational use, and also, by the way, grow for the medicinal cannabis industry as well. So for me, it's just a no-brainer to stop wasting our taxpayers' money with police helicopters hovering over the Kiwi bush, hounding down ordinary citizens who are, having a joint of cannabis for recreation rather than a glass of wine, hunting down the Kiwis who are desperate for some kind of relief because of a medical or clinical condition that they have. Let's stop all that. Stop wasting the money on the police, the helicopters, the prosecutors, the courts, the jails. Let's put it into something better. We can all think of high priority things that we would like our taxpayers' money to go on. And this has to be the worst use, actually, of what we waste taxpayers' money on.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, we're getting a few comments through that there's a theme. And some of the fears that people are raising in the Q&A are fears that we've heard during this whole debate. And I think there's a lot of undecided voters who worry about these things. And so there's kind of three fears that people are expressing. One, and this is a question to all the panelists. One is the question of, aren't we just creating a commercialized market which comes with its own problems, as we've seen with tobacco and alcohol. Related to that, aren't we trying to be smoke-free? How can you be a smoke-free country with tobacco when you're legalizing cannabis? and then related fears around, or two related fears around impairment on the road. Hinimur touched on that before, but aren't we going to see more drugged drivers on the road, and aren't we going to see more drugged workers? How do we deal with impairment in the workplace? So I'll throw that question to each of you. Is how, here are some of the fears, and we hear them a lot. What are your responses to those?
Shall I kick off?
Yeah.
So perhaps a few key points from my experience as a clinician in terms of we know that people are doing these things now. We know that people are smoking cannabis in the workplace and are driving under the influence of cannabis now. And there is no easy way to support people with their perhaps problem use, with their unhealthy relationship with cannabis. So we know that there are at least 10,000 people in New Zealand right now today who need help with cannabis-related issues, who are getting nothing at all. So the estimates have been done, probably about 490 million from the last report that I read, $490 million from taxation from the cannabis, which would be sold under the legal and regulated framework, would be available for really meaningful ways of working with people and educating people. So that's sort of, once people do have a problem with cannabis, we don't really have any mechanisms for that, robust mechanisms that are available around the country now, but also preventing people from having problem relationships with cannabis. We can do a lot for people, for young people, to help them make better informed decisions. We can help parents have those critical conversations with their kids, which currently they don't know how to have. Parents are much more au fait with talking about alcohol and alcohol-related harms, but it's a bit of an amorphous one, and it would be very helpful, I know from talking to many parents around the country, to have this legal and regulated framework to give them some external parameters for those kinds of conversations. So those are just a couple of comments from my sphere.
Cool, thank you. Helen or Steve?
Yeah, I mean, on the commercialization thing, I mean, I think it's one of the things that really struck me about the bill is that at the retail point, which I think is the main concern, I'm actually less concerned about commercialization in terms of production, because that's licensed and sort of out of sight, as it were. At the retail point, you've got unbranded products with health warnings on. You've got a complete ban on all advertising. And you have, and there's very strict controls on the signage of the stores themselves. So, and there's no sponsorship of sports events. We're not going to have kind of weed sponsored sports teams and ridiculous stuff like that we have with alcohol still, and have in the past had with tobacco. So I think the concerns about aggressive marketing and branding and promotions are well addressed by this bill. So I think we don't have to fear there. Yes, there are some concerns about corporate capture or undue influence of corporate money on the policy making process. But this bill, it will, the bill will be law, and the ability for the corporates to influence it are actually relatively limited. And I also noticed that no one company can have more than 20% of the licenses. So we've got kind of anti-monopolization controls are hardwired into the legislation. So I'm actually very reassured by that. One of the failings I think in Canada is that we have seen a kind of monopolization of a very few companies dominating the market, and I think that is a problem. It is a problem, but it seems that the controls are in place for that. Drug driving, I mean, in terms of cannabis driving, I mean, it's illegal now, and it will be illegal afterwards. So just bear that in mind. Cannabis driving is not being legalized. And if anything, there will be resources available for public health education, which will include educating people about the risks of cannabis impaired driving, and enforcement of rules against cannabis impaired driving. It is, as Hinimur has said, it is actually very difficult to police because the testing of blood THC levels is something of it's a tricky area of science. Personally, I think we'd be better off testing impairment, but again, that's a whole that is a whole tricky area. And these aren't difficult. These aren't just problems for New Zealand. These are problems the world over. Whether cannabis is legal or not, enforcing rules around drug impaired driving is a technically very challenging area of law anyway. And it's certainly not as easy as it is for alcohol, where you can have a breathalyzer and your blood alcohol level transfers very directly into impairment. It just doesn't work like that with cannabis, annoyingly. But the main point I would say is we're not legalizing drug impaired driving. So people don't have to panic about that. The idea, and there is absolutely nothing in the messaging that's coming from government or the public health messaging that is going to say cannabis impaired driving is okay. The exact opposite is true, and if anything, the volume of those messages is going to increase. So again, and especially looking around the world, the panic that there's going to be this vast spike in cannabis impaired driving related accidents and crashes simply hasn't happened. Alcohol is legal. Alcohol related crashes have been going down for years due to better public health education and better enforcement. So there's no reason we can't do that with cannabis. Tobacco regulation has increased and developed and got better around much of the world, in part due to things like the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is one of the great triumph of the World Health Organization and the UN. And we've seen at the same time cannabis use has been rising, tobacco use has been going down, and it's a legal drug operating within a commercial industry. So again, how you regulate and how you mitigate the risks of a commercial market are absolutely vital. And I'm very reassured by what's in this bill, that those risks have been considered and they have been addressed in a responsible way.
Cool, thanks, Steve. Helen, do you have any comments to add around those issues?
Yes, I think this bill has been designed very much with the experience of regulating tobacco in mind. And I speak as the Minister of Health, who in 1990 took the smoke-free environments legislation through the New Zealand Parliament. And I, as a young health minister in 1989, went to the WHA, the World Health Assembly, with strong advocacy for the proposal of negotiating the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which, as Steve says, has been a tremendous global success. Now, in endeavouring to regulate tobacco harm, no one suggested you prohibit the product, because that, just as with cannabis, or when prohibition of alcohol was tried back in the early 20th century, that would just hand a market over to the illegal market to organised crime to get rich off. No point at all. So you try to regulate around the fact that it has been commonly used, and you want to put the health arguments out there and restrict opportunities for sale and advertising. So with tobacco, it got right away on the world, right? It was something that began to be widely distributed to troops in World War I. They came home with the habit. It took about 40 years for the major problems to show up, and then we all retrospectively try to get it back in the box. And we had to fight big tobacco. Now, we don't want to fight big cannabis, and that's why the controls of the bill are quite important. You can't advertise it, right? No company can have more than 20% of the market, only be sold under quite strict conditions in the licensed premises. So we learn from all this. But I'm absolutely convinced that bringing it out into the open in a controlled way is the way to go. The harms of prohibition are far greater than the harms of legalization. And we can't really effectively address public health issues when something is illegal. It reminds me actually of the issues that arose with the HIV epidemic. That one of the first steps the New Zealand Parliament took was to repeal the law which had criminalised male homosexual behaviour MSM, men having sex with men, because how could we advocate effectively and work with the community if their behavior was unlawful? It was a no-brainer. And I think, you know, the same approach applies here. Widely used drug, bring it into the open, don't say it's illegal, deal with the issues up front, have appropriate regulation. That's the sensible approach.
Fantastic. I want to address the question of, again, undecided voters have this fear of the gateway effect. Hinimur, the Prime Minister's science report, sort of touches on this. So I'll get you to respond to the gateway effect. And then Steve, I might get you to respond to the gateway effect from a different perspective around, can legal regulation disconnect people, you know, help close the door or the gate to other substances, like in New Zealand, methamphetamine's a problem. So some argue that legal regulation can actually help address other illicit drug issues. But Hinimur, first, what have you seen in your practice, but then also what did the science advisors report say around the gateway effect in young people?
So in a nutshell, there's no evidence for a gateway effect in terms of cannabis being causally linked to somebody then going on to what's called harder and harder drugs. What I have seen strikingly in my practice over the last 10 years or more, particularly in acute inpatient child and adolescent mental health, where people are coming into hospital acutely unwell, is that more and more now, in contrast to 10 or so years ago, we're seeing young people who had easy access to methamphetamine. So methamphetamine is much easier to access in most of New Zealand than cannabis. This might shock some of the people watching this to hear, but this is the reality. So, and so the literature around the world, there's some evidence of that in other parts of the world, although we have our unique, sadly unique environment at the moment in terms of the methamphetamine context. So two key points there. The clinical picture has changed in the last 10 years. Methamphetamine is very much part of the problem and has much more severe and serious, complex effects on young people's mental health and their development, and also much more serious legal consequences, and compared to cannabis. Just maybe would make a couple of other points about alcohol too there, compared to cannabis. So there are no known cases of toxic cannabis death in New Zealand, whereas we know that, for example, there are 600 to 800 alcohol-related deaths in New Zealand every year. We have about 1,800 babies born with fetal alcohol syndrome disorder in New Zealand every year, and about 65% of suicide attempts in the UK. I haven't seen good data about this here. 65% of suicide attempts in the UK are alcohol related. So for me, those aspects of other substances in terms of this whole conversation about gateway, those people have not been influenced by some kind of experience with cannabis, which then led them to use alcohol in a certain way or use methamphetamine in a certain way, which then impacted on poorer health outcomes.
Thank you. Steve, do you want to address the substitution argument? Can cannabis, legal cannabis, help break a connection?
Yeah, I mean, in terms, I absolutely agree with Hinimur in terms of the gateway effect, and as a lot of people, there's nothing about smoking or using cannabis that would, intrinsically or physiologically lead you to use other drugs, and indeed most people who use cannabis don't try other drugs. But if there is a gateway, it is probably through the illegal market, in as far as your interaction with the illegal market may expose you to people selling other drugs. And clearly, if you're buying through a legal market, that would be reduced, in as far as if you go, you don't get offered methamphetamine when you go to buy alcohol from an off license, and you won't get offered methamphetamine if you go to buy cannabis from a legal store. you might get offered methamphetamine if you're buying on a street corner. Now, I wouldn't want to overplay that argument, but nonetheless, I mean, reduced exposure to illegal vendors and street dealers can only be a good thing. In terms of substitution, the evidence is quite ambiguous, actually, whether alcohol and cannabis are substitutes or complements. I think it probably differs amongst different populations. For some individuals, cannabis can be a very useful way of reducing their use of other more risky drugs. And there has been some research, for example, giving cannabis to problematic stimulant users, methamphetamine, crack cocaine users, that has shown that they reduce their use of the more risky drugs. Again, the evidence, these are underdeveloped research areas, so I wouldn't want to overplay that, but there is some compelling evidence there. But as Hinimur said, that there really isn't evidence that somehow if you try cannabis, you're on a slippery slope to kind of addiction and depravity. I mean, this is classic kind of reefer madness scaremongering. As Hinimur has very much shown, made clear, the underlying drivers of problematic drug use tend to be childhood adversity, histories of trauma, social deprivation, histories of abuse, mental health problems, history of being in care. It's those kinds of things that we need to address if we want to deal with problematic drug use in the longer term. Just kind of pointing at a drug and going, oh, look, and demonizing it. It's childishly simplistic, and it's not based in evidence at all.
Great, thanks, Steve. It's great to see a lot of chats happening. I think there's a few side discussions happening in the chat, which is great to see. What's also great to see is that we've got quite a lot of people coming in from all around the world. So welcome to our colleagues from Mexico and our colleagues from Australia, including Fiona Patton, Member of Parliament for the Victorian State Parliament. So it's great to have you here. Helen, a question for you, and this is, I guess, moving more into the political stuff. Your message to people on this webinar who are staunch supporters for yes, what do they need to do over the next 10 weeks? What's their responsibility in terms of in terms of the referendum and the campaign?
I think there's three things that people can do. Firstly, talk with your family and friends, because often people haven't focused on this in anything like the way that those of us who are very passionate about it have. So they haven't really heard the arguments. And once people hear that this is not a referendum about whether or not cannabis should be available, it is available. It's about getting some controls around the availability, proper licensed premises, not selling to underage, specifying content so people know exactly what they're buying, a responsible approach to regulation. Then people start to say, oh, I get it. This is not about a free-for-all. It's actually about putting some rules around what has been operating undercover and being able to deal up front with public health issues, as has been stressed. Secondly, having spoken with family and friends, do make sure they're on the electoral roll. Still in our country, so many people turn up to vote on the day or a couple of weeks before with the early voting, and their name's not there. Make sure your name's there. It's so easy to do a search on the internet for how do I register to vote in New Zealand. Up comes the site. You can do it online. Check your registration details. Are you still registered at the flat you were at 5 years before? Update it all. Get ready and spread the word about registration. It's a good thing in any case in a democratic society for people to make sure they're enrolled to vote. And then, thirdly, use your social media. Just about everyone these days, they're on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or Instagram or LinkedIn, you name it. We've got many outlets. So tell your friends what you're thinking, why you're thinking, and how important it is to take this once in a generation opportunity to get this right.
Fantastic, thanks, Helen. We need to wrap up just because, you know, time flies when you're having fun. But over to Hinimur and Steve, any final comments? Hinimur, any comments, messages that you would have to those people still sitting on the fence?
Well, I mean, for me, I just, you know, I look at you, I look at New Zealand enviously, and, you know, I wish that our country was having a debate this reasonable and informed and enlightened. And you know, I wish our government was able to, you know, engage in such a mature and evidence-based debate. I ideally hope that yes does win. I think you could be a guiding light for the rest of the world as we follow down a similar path. I hope that people who were listening, who may have been undecided, have been moved towards yes. And if you are, do campaign, have the discussions with your networks and your peer groups. You know, you can turn one yes vote into 10 yes votes, and they can turn it into 100 yes votes. And even if you don't want to do that, by all means, make a donation to New Zealand Drug Policy Foundation so they can air their brilliant TV ads, and vote yes.
Thanks, Steve. Hinimur.
Yeah, very briefly, to our kaumātua, to our nannies and our koros who are undoubtedly worried about moko, worried about our young ones. Listen to their stories. Sit down as a whānau, listen to people's stories, the reality of what's been happening. Our rangatahi has stood down from school, and really that affects their whole trajectory throughout their lives. So keep an open mind, whānau. This can be a highly polarizing kind of issue, and I'm hoping that we can talk about the grey zone. It's not about them and us. We all live in this country. We are all affected by cannabis. Let's try to listen to each other with an open heart and with a critical mind, and really make the right decision so that our young people are protected, because they're not protected at the moment, and that we're better set up to educate our citizenry and to put this firmly in the health arena rather than where it is now, which is in criminal justice. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou.
Kia ora. Thank you, Hinimur. I'm going to wrap up and close now, and I just want to end with just a few final comments. You know, I think it is worth remembering that legalisation isn't inventing a thing. It isn't inventing cannabis. Cannabis is here now, and New Zealanders are quite high users of cannabis, particularly young New Zealanders. So this is about, is the current system protecting us? And the simple answer is no, it's not. We do need to take a new approach, and we are convinced that the approach outlined in the Cannabis Control and Legalisation Bill is the right one. We think the government's done a fantastic job at doing that balancing act in terms of trying to get good public health controls in place. And in terms of knowledge and in terms of getting informed, if you don't believe what the Drug Foundation and others are saying, do look at the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor's report that came out. That is a brilliant assessment of the evidence around cannabis, both from New Zealand and around the world, looking at a whole lot of different issues: health, mental health, the social and criminal justice impacts. So do get informed. In a final pitch, and repeating what Steve just said, we do need to win this. It is a once in a generation chance. If New Zealanders vote no, then that closes the door to a whole lot of important discussions. And so the Drug Foundation is fronting a campaign called Vote Yes on Our Terms, which Hinimur is involved in as well. And that campaign that we're running is targeted at undecided voters. And in that campaign, we are talking about the key controls that are in the bill, which we hope will reassure particularly parents around this issue. And our campaign also talks about 3 key benefits that we think legal regulation can bring. The first is that it will improve access to people who use cannabis for medical reasons. It will free up police time to focus on more serious crime. And it will bring tax income to the government, which has to be reinvested into things like drug education and treatment. Now, it costs a lot of money to run a political campaign. Might surprise you to see how expensive it is to stick things on TV. So we're asking people to, if you are a yes voter, to chip in, and we have a Pledge Me crowdfunding campaign, which Carly has put the web link in the chat. So do check that out and do flick us some money if you can. Carly's also put the link that Helen mentioned around the Electoral Commission, the enrolment link. So do check that you're enrolled. Do make sure your friends and family do get enrolled, even if they're going to vote no. People should get enrolled and engage in the political process. I really want to thank our 3 panelists for joining us. It's fantastic to have a brilliant, high caliber panelists, and special thanks to Steve, for whom it's quite early in the morning in London. It was very good of you, sir, to join us. And thank you all for all of the people who have joined us on the webinar and on Facebook Live, especially those people that are dialing in from around the world. It's lovely to have you. Carly, I know we said that this was our last one, but I'm really convinced that we need to have a couple of other webinars, and we'll let you all know what those topics are going to be and when they are. So look, everyone, thank you so much for your time, and have a fabulous day, and please remember to enrol and to vote. Thanks so much.